Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, April 20th, 2020. You know how we do these things. It is, do they have an Eastern Orthodox Easter Monday? Because it was Eastern Orthodox Easter. We definitely had that. What about the Monday? I don't know. I'll have to check with an Eastern Orthodox person, and we'll let you know what they have to say. Or, I don't know. My calendar doesn't say it. Usually pretty reliable about those things, although I don't know if it has Easter Monday on it anyway. So I don't think it's discriminating as between Western Protestant and Roman Catholic Easter and Eastern Orthodox Easter. It's just the Monday, but both Mondays are missing. Okay. Well, lots of things are missing this Monday. Federal leadership, for instance, is missing this Monday, as it is on most Mondays during our coronavirus pandemic. We'll be discussing that. Still people waking up to, I mean, it's a good thing. Don't get me wrong. I don't fault them for being late. This is just one of those things that it takes time to raise awareness about important issues across the board. But still people waking up to the fact that the federal government is allegedly running around and I guess I really allegedly belongs here. They are running around and seizing under alleged federal authority, seizing PPE from states trying to acquire it for their hospitals, from hospitals trying to acquire it on their own for their own use. And this is the piracy that we've been talking about for, I guess, about 2 weeks plus now. But I think I wouldn't say we could call it a game changer, but the story certainly got a boost from a report in the New England Journal of Medicine, of all places, about the difficulties that hospitals in Massachusetts, I believe, have had in trying to get the PPE for themselves. Remember, of course, that Donald Trump has declared that the federal government isn't there to do this sort of thing. Can't be a shipping clerk, et cetera, et cetera. That testing is going to be the state responsibility, and the states really are the ones who have to step up, and they should have prepared with their own PPE, and they should have prepared with their own tests, even though the federal government didn't. I don't know how they were supposed to know if the federal government did know and did nothing. Not real sure where the state cues were supposed to come from in all of this. I suppose you could argue that the states should have been, well, I mean, he does argue that the states should have been preparing their own stockpiles of medical necessities, PPE, etc., just for general preparedness purposes, whether they knew that the coronavirus pandemic in specific was coming, probably shouldn't matter. That then, there's a reasonable excuse for that, I guess, but I don't know if that really holds. I suppose you would have to give some decent warning for something like that to be considered effective. It's been considered the province of the federal government for, let's say since World War II. Since they began preparing for pandemics, certainly, anyway. It's really never been a state matter before. These are things that require a national response. And as we've explained in the past, and I don't want to linger on it too long right now, but it is a big story. There are many others, of course. But the authority under which the federal government claims to be able to confiscate, waylay, steal, pirate, redirect, if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, these shipments, without taking you all the way back to law school, and making you stay there for 3+ years, basically when there's competition like this, and there ought not to be, that's the major theory here. But when there's competition like this between the states and also between the states and the federal government, and you end up in court trying to decide who has the right to do this thing, whether it's receive this paid-for shipment of PPE or anything else. The federal courts tend, in the modern era, to look at things with an eye towards empowering the federal government, which used to drive a lot of actual traditional federalists crazy. They wanted to stand up for the states, without using their phrase, but I guess there's no other way to do it, the states' rights in these positions. But there developed a doctrine of recognizing a federal primacy in these things, particularly when a unified response across all states made a certain amount of sense, or was a matter of national security, or both, as might be argued in this case. And so courts tended to recognize the power of the federal government in preference to powers either traditionally handled by, owned by, or now claimed by the states. But the idea of doing so was to enable a more coordinated response. A unified federal response would make sense in most cases, and certainly in these cases, and that's why the courts created the sort of authority that the federal government has that Donald Trump really only knows about from watching television shows and movies where federal agents arrive and, whatever, the disaster that's happening, the state and local police are on the scene, and then the FBI shows up and they say, Don Jones, FBI, we'll take over from here. And everybody says they will take over from here because that's the way it works. The federal government, the big one, shows up and takes over all the authority from all the other states because a coordinated federal response with federal resources where people are training for this sort of thing all the time, and maybe your state and local police aren't, whatever. That's the way it works in the movies. So Trump thinks the federal government just inherently has this power to seize these shipments because it's the federal government, and that's not the way it works. There's a real doctrine behind it and a real reason why the courts recognize it, and to be using that power to seize PPE, to seize ventilators even, and redirect them according to the will of the federal government, but also at the same time to be holding press conferences saying the federal government recognizes no responsibility in itself for providing any of these things. It's up to the states, but we're still going to claim to have the power to steal from the states, even though we have no intention of helping them later on in any real coordinated way other than to use them as campaign giveaways. If you're a Republican and you support me for president, you'll get your PPE, you'll get your ventilators. That's a whole separate crime. But this is something that I think we've explained it before, but I really wanted to reiterate that since the New England Journal of Medicine piece made such a splash and is now the subject of a second round of articles analyzing this, in case those of you out there who don't subscribe or can't read all the way through articles like that. There's no jargon, as far as I know, in that piece. But that had a big impact, and not just because it's shocking, but also because the New England Journal of Medicine, not really someplace frequently accused of taking wild outlier political stances. And I bet Greg Dworkin knows all about that. And he's here to tell you, well, probably 200 other things, but maybe that too. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. Maybe that too. When we get to the Dave Weigel piece about taking sides with death, we'll get to why the New England Journal did what it did. But there's a new follow of mine. Which I didn't realize I should have been following. His name is Donnie O'Sullivan, who describes himself as very Irish. Yes. But he's a reporter at CNN, and he covers disinformation, politics, and technology, which sounds like a really interesting interface for us.
Yes, and they shouldn't cover disinformation, but I get you.
Facebook says it has removed promotion of anti-quarantine events in California, New Jersey, and Nebraska after consultation with state governments. Mm-hmm. Says it's working to get answers from New York, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania as to whether the anti-quarantine protest breaks those states' social distancing measures. And groups promoting anti-quarantine protests have popped up all over Facebook in the past few days. Another source says it's all from the same person. And this particular Washington Post article says pro-gun activists using Facebook groups to push anti-quarantine protests. A trio of far-right pro-gun provocateurs is behind some of the largest Facebook groups calling for these protests.
Ooh la la.
And at all of them, of course, we see the Confederate flags.
Yes.
This particular one has a picture in Michigan with a Heil Whitmer sign.
Yes. And a backwards swastika.
But what's equally iconic in terms of a picture is the one from the New York Times that I posted to you just above that, where you see healthcare workers basically standing in front of these protesters' cars the way people stand in front of tanks.
Right. This was in Denver. I mean, it's in the New York Times, but it was in Denver. Also iconic. You're right.
So those are some of the things that I think are of major interest this morning for us in regard to how those protests go, because this is what we mean when we say AstroTurf. It's not like the people showing up there aren't sincere. They're sincere nutcases.
True.
And they're organized by politics. So Trump is in the interesting position of being the government organizing anti-government protests. And if you don't think that he's a proto-fascist or a authoritarian, this is exactly how it works. These fake protests, which are done basically to support him, which have nothing to do with organic, everybody's upset. In fact, the polls say the opposite. 3 out of 4 people are afraid that the government will open up too early. And you cannot go back to work, which helps Trump politically. That's another series of tweets from Maggie Haberman today, just pointing out that some of Trump's advisors are blunt about it. They think that it'll hurt people, but it'll help his reelection, so therefore he's going to do it, which is what happens when you hire Jared as a consultant, because it's neither good politics nor good policy. But that's the background for this. So this Dave Weigel piece is the trailer. Is the president on protesters' side? They're on his.
Okay.
The campaign to liberate states from coronavirus stay-at-home restrictions ramped up with a Fox News segment that mentioned Liberate Minnesota as a group organizing anti-quarantine protests, which inspired tweets from President Trump calling for liberations of Michigan, Minnesota, and Virginia. But on Saturday evening, asked about the rallies that violated social distancing guidelines, Trump said he was getting along very nicely with the governor of Michigan, who basically said, you're better off 6 feet apart than 6 feet under.
Yeah. This has been rather amazing. They've done they did a pretty good job of, I guess, whatever the central authority was here, sending out the memo. Let's lose the Confederate and Nazi imagery and replace, because now the president says he is on their side, and there are very fine people on both sides of the virus once again. And but you could tell that they were patriots now because they all had American flags.
Well, these protests, Weigel writes, were initially designed to target both parties, at least rhetorically, while the protests, the original ones against Obama, the Tea Party stuff, was originally supposed to target both parties in terms of rhetoric, even though it was meant to be one.
I get you.
But they tried to make it bipartisan and say, we're not against Democrats, we're against anybody who does what Democrats want.
Yeah, right. Sure.
Right? At least rhetorically. But these protests are totally pro-Trump. And Weigel writes, channeling populist anger into his own campaign, something Trump did instinctively and powerfully 4 years ago, is not coming as easily to a president whose reelection could depend on the speed of national recovery. I'll get to that in terms of why that's a false hope. I'm frustrated and wish I had someone to protest, Larry Hogan from Maryland said, one of the Republicans who's faced anti-stay-at-home protests. But I don't think it's helpful to encourage demonstrations and encourage people to go against president's own policy. President's policy says you can't start to reopen under his plan until you have declining numbers for 14 days, which those states and my state do not have. Then there's the campaign hats and the flags and the Alex Jones stuff. But I think Jesse Ferguson, a good spokesperson for the DCCC back in the day, he was their spokesperson during the 2010 Tea Party backlash, says these protests may be a crystallizing moment, but not in the way Trump thinks. At the start, it wasn't clear that one party would position as combating the virus and the other would position as supporting its spread. But these protesters have put Trump in exactly that position.
That's weird. Well, yeah, they have. I mean, there's no other way to look at it.
But wait, there's more.
Well, there is another way to look at it. Let's look at it.
No, just more of the same.
No, there's more of the same. That's
Fresh
right.
polling suggests Trump's ability to shape opinion about the pandemic is limited. In the new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, 58% of registered voters said they're more worried about infection spiking if restrictions ended too quickly than about whether restrictions hurt the economy. Other polls, it's more like 70. 56% of those voters did not trust the president to share accurate information. 45 to 36, more of them trusted Biden. And when asked about public figures more generally, 60% of voters said they trusted Fauci, 36% said they trusted Trump, and the same polling found a small uptick in support for the president last month, but has begun to find him falling back. Gallup was at 49, now at 43. He's at 39 to 40 in the MSN tracker, which generally is ahead of the regular call-in polls. So we'll see what happens over the next week in regard to that kind of polling. And this is even while the president's dominating near daily briefings about the virus. So you have a lot of Republicans who are not Jared Kushner saying you really need not to be on TV so much. This is not helping us.
Yes. Well, they're probably actually correct this time.
Yeah, they are. And then we have Dan Dresner, who crystallizes all this. If you heard any of the segments on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday of my show with David's show with me, my parts, right?
Yes.
You will get this, because this is what it said. Everyone is in denial about November, writes Dan Dresner, this 2016 hangover. And to me, this just crystallizes everything.
Okay.
And he talks about some of the weekend stuff, which, there's just so much to cover. We can't cover it all on the show, which is, by the way, David's show. That's why I always let him speak. My personal favorite is this headline on an Associated Press story. Coronavirus could complicate Trump's path to re-election. Now, I know, Dresner writes, AP is as straight-laced as possible, and to be fair, the story is straightforward. But this is equivalent to a headline on December 8th, 1941, saying Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor could complicate America's first desire for isolationism.
Yes.
Right? Times, LA Times, Washington Post all ran stories over the weekend covering the Trump campaign's belief that it can attack Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, as being soft on China.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Jonathan Martin and Maggie Haberman report that while Mr. Trump's team knows his own words will be used against him, they believe they can contrast his history favorably with that of Mr. Biden. And then in the Post, President Trump's campaign is preparing to launch a broad effort aimed at linking Joe Biden to China after concluding that it would be more politically effective than defending or promoting Trump's response to the pandemic.
Well, yeah, why do that?
Right? So he says, all of these stories are interesting, but they contain an air of unreality. They assume the Trump campaign's gambits can somehow alter the trajectory of the general election campaign. The thing is, Biden's going to have a pretty easy rejoinder to Trump about being soft on China, eager to continue trade talks, uneasy about further rattling the markets, and hungry to protect his relationship with President Xi. Mr. Trump has repeatedly muddied Republican efforts to fault China. Remember the China virus, the Wuhan virus?
Right.
Or one of my ex-friends who likes to call it the Wuhan bat virus. I mean, these are all things that they put out there because eventually the purpose of it is to get you inoculated to the idea that somehow or other China had nothing to do with it. What you should be doing is blaming China. And then they could write this, and then a week later saying, hey, everybody's talking about China,
Look.
and it just might work.
Yeah, I guess so. Janine Pirro screamed about it over the weekend. Wuhan!
Right, exactly. But Biden's tactical response isn't the important thing. The important thing is that campaign tactics, writing Dan Dresner here, are meaningless when the administration has bungled its pandemic response and the economy is cratering. And by the way, there's 40,000 dead, same as Vietnam War. As noted in this space last week, Trump is starting the fourth quarter of the campaign behind, lousy field position. Biden's beating him in the polls. Democrats have united. Trump can't campaign on the economy. Attacking Biden on China is like trying to bail out the Titanic with a toy bucket. Further, spending 2 hours a day at the podium doesn't help Trump. His antics might appeal to his base, but there's a reason other Republicans want him to cut down his appearances, and that's with links. They put all of his weaknesses on display, and for those who fear that this crowds out Biden, let me suggest that at this point in the race, the more Biden appears in the public mind as generic Democrat, the better his chances for victory is the safer not Trump choice.
That's interesting.
The Trump team seems to think there's two, because where's Biden? Where's Biden? Biden's doing fine. He's giving a near daily briefing. He has town halls. He's doing enough to remind you he's still alive, and that's really all he has to do at this point. I think that Dresner's absolutely right.
He's manning the free rope stand.
The virtual rope stand.
Yeah,
Trump team seems to think there are two ways to cope with this. Wall Street Journal says, President has discussed political ramifications extensively with top advisors, including Jared Kushner.
Well, he is a top advisor.
That he is. So that's why the advice is so bad.
Right.
They have formed a consensus that I wonder if he charges Trump for this. He probably does. They have formed, and then Trump doesn't pay him. So it's a perfect relationship. They have formed a consensus that criticism by Democrats, the media, and others, that the administration was slow to respond to the pandemic isn't as potent if there's a strong counterargument that no one was well prepared.
That seems to be their thought, yeah.
Dresner says it's a pretty fanciful argument given the warnings the Trump team received. And there's extensive side by side. They were told. They ignored it, and they were told.
They were telling.
The best practices have not so far been developed in the United States. The breakthroughs so far have not been American, said Ben Smith of the New York Times.
True, good point.
Once the rest of the developed world moves to reopen their economies more quickly than the U.S., this narrative is going to fall flat. And the other possibility is a successful economic reopening changes the narrative for Trump. But that's not going to work either. All the available polling shows the American people strongly support the restrictions on activity to combat the coronavirus. We just went over that. And Trump could proclaim the economy reopened, but he can't make uncomfortable Americans go back to pre-coronavirus normality. And as long as that is true, the back-to-business narrative won't fly. Right? You have these protesters saying this is all bogus, and some of them are wearing masks.
That's true, too. I did see that.
Which is kind of odd.
Right.
And they're confronting the doctors over this. Who do you think's more popular, the protesters or the doctors?
Yes. I think they're banging pots and pans for the doctors, and people would just like to hit the protesters.
I don't see them singing at 7 o'clock p.m. every night in New York City for the protesters.
I have never. And you won't, because
no one
knows where they are, and if they did, they'd hate them and maybe throw the pots and pans at them.
Right. The New York Times' Don McNeil, who's the science guy, talked to experts about what to expect for the next year or so. Although these experts did not agree on everything, it was impossible to avoid gloomy forecasts for the next year. The scenario that Trump has been unrolling, or it's the Times that they say Mr. Trump, which I tend to not want to do, been unrolling at his daily press briefings that the lockdowns will end soon, is a fantasy, most experts said. Now, new attacks on Biden will feed lots of media narratives. They'll not alter the brute facts of this campaign. The fact remains Trump lost the popular vote, barely eked out an electoral college victory in 2016. November's election will be a referendum on his presidency, and the country will be worse off in every possible way compared to 4 years ago. I mean, all of that is true. And then people will say, yeah, but the national polls mean nothing. It's all about the battlegrounds, which, by the way, isn't true. If it were true, then following the Democratic generic ballot in the House would not have told us how well we were going to do in 1918. But it did, because they're correlated, even though the generic ballot is not looking at each individual race. I don't care about the generic ballot. I only care about what's going on in my Well, it gives you an idea what's going on. It told us they were going to win the House. When the generic ballot for the national race is big enough, that's going to spill over into what's going to happen in your close battleground states. And to drive this point home, which may not be true for the rest of the time. After all, these polls only become accurate about 100 days before the election, and we're about 200. But Josh Krasnower points out the new NBC Wall Street Journal poll, which has Biden ahead, 49-42 nationally. It also breaks out the Trump-Biden matchup in 11 battlegrounds: Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. More on Wisconsin in a minute.
Both worlds.
But in those 11 battlegrounds, Biden 49, Trump 43.
All right. So that
which is the same as the 49-42 nationally.
That's weird. I wonder why these closely divided battleground states mirror the closely divided battleground countries so closely.
Right. Now, if you look at the MSN polling from today, pick a state. The thing I like about it is that they have this little slider on it. So you can go back and see what was going on like March 1st.
Oh.
Right. On March 1st, would you be more likely to vote for Republican or Democrat in Wisconsin? On March 1st, Democrat 49, Republican 44. And we'll talk about why that is. We saw that in the election, that for the judge that just happened. But now it's Democrat 51, Republican 43. And specifically for Biden, back on March 1st, it was Trump 42, Biden 46. And now it's Trump 41, Biden 49. So things have been trending blue-ish during this time that Trump is mishandling the pandemic. And that all matters. The reason things are happening in Wisconsin. Now, you know about crucial Waukesha County, right? You know, we all know that.
Crucial,
and the suburban WOW counties.
Yes.
With Washington, Waukesha, and Ozaukee.
Okay. WOW.
Pronunciation, welcome. But those are the WOW counties.
All right.
Okay. But in this particular election, there was a lot of swingy counties that happened near Green Bay.
Swingy.
Okay. And they're Brown,
yes.
Outagamie, please help me with the pronunciation, and Winnebago. That one I know.
Okay, right.
But those are the Bow counties.
Bow? Oh, yes, Brown. They just had their
Outagamie, Winnebago. So I'm not the first one who noted that the Bow Wow counties in Wisconsin are the ones that really are going to determine the election.
Bow.
And the point about the Wow counties is that they were solidly red, and now they're only pinkish. And that's where Republicans win. That's where they get their margin over Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't happen. The conservative vote was down further in the WOW counties than it was in the rest of the state, and that's how the Democrat won the judgeship.
Yeah. Well, I like that, and of course, I love having them abbreviated as Bow Wow. That's pretty good.
But it's all trending blue, folks. So don't be fooled about. Well, but 2016. Get over 2016. Move on.
Okay.
2016.
Well, it's not anymore. That's true. We'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday. But our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We just had our own little 2-minute show in the background there, and well, there's more stories happening, and we'll leave it up to Greg one more time to walk us in any direction you like. Where are we going next, Greg?
Well, let's finish up with a couple of observations. I had pulled up this morning on Twitter the 2008 and 2012 and 2016 graphs from Real Clear Politics about how polling was going. Okay, and each one is a little distinct for its own reason, but I think interesting in its own right nonetheless. And for example, the one that I really started with was 2016 because I wanted to, just sort of illustrate the fact that in 2016, things were really volatile. On April 10th, 2016, Clinton was leading by 10 points, but just a couple of weeks later, it was tied. And then Clinton was leading again, and then it was tied, and then Trump got ahead, and then it was tied, and then Clinton got ahead, and then it was tied, and then at the very end, Comey and then Trump won. But very volatile. It was all over the place, right? Back in October of 2016, a year before the election, there was only a 2 or 3 point difference between them. And the graphs merge, and then they go apart, then they get together and go apart, all over the place. 2020, yes. Completely different. Biden has had a solid lead the entire time. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those, you look at Trump's job approval, and you look at the lines, and you say, my goodness, no matter what happens, those lines don't change. What does that mean? Well, it means that Trump has a solid base, and so you can never count him out. Okay, well, look at these lines. This is Biden versus Trump, and Biden is winning the entire time, and those lines don't change. Yeah, well, everybody knows they're going to change right before the. Well, which don't change are you going with? The one that says Trump's base doesn't change, therefore that's good for him, and Biden's lead doesn't change, therefore that's bad for him?
Nothing in particular or bad. Yeah, I guess that's a good gimmitarian approach. You're holding the line very well, so the party is happy for you.
Right. But the fact of the matter is Trump never goes up. Even in a rally round the flag moment, he doesn't go up.
Yeah.
His pitiful bump compared to the governors.
Oh, yeah. Right. There was that.
And the other one that the civics folks point out, Drew Linzer pointed out to me, that whereas Trump's job performance really hasn't changed all that much. If you look at what do you think of the economy, it spiked to like 70% is bad. The polls move when the public moves. There's nothing wrong with the polls. The polls are picking up actual sentiment. We know from Navigator research, and we're not going to have our update until Tuesday because they take the weekend off, but Navigator research shows that when Trump hits 50%, it's 37% I love him and 13% I really don't love him, but I got to give him the benefit of the doubt during this emergency. Mm-hmm. So that 13% is very soft. And 37% is terrible numbers. So 2020, not volatile at all. 2016, incredibly volatile. I was reminded painfully of 2004 and watching the Kerry W match, which also was very close, by the way. People don't remember this, but there's times Bush led, there's times Kerry led. It went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth up until September when the polls became accurate. And then Bush developed a 3-point lead starting in like September. Mm-hmm. And for the next 2 months, it didn't change. No matter what happened, Bush stayed ahead. It was really frustrating. It's like, it's only 3 points. Why can't we catch him? And we never did. So sometimes a 3-point lead is incredibly durable.
I guess so.
Depending upon circumstance.
Frustrating, but durable. Okay.
Right? But I remember feeling, it's not that far. How come we can't catch him? And there's a time where it's not durable. In 2012, Obama led Romney pretty much the entire way. And then had a bad debate. Romney caught up. And then Obama had a good debate. And then he went ahead. And then he finally won.
Okay. So
there's an illustration where the guy who's ahead most of the time generally wins. And that would have happened in 2016, but for Comey is my position. And I think I'm right about that. So 2016 was really a black swan, and it really should not affect everybody's analysis of what's going on. Dresner's right. Trump is in deep political trouble. And his plan for getting out of it is only going to keep his base where it is. That's not going to help him win the election because his base is simply not big enough to win with, and that's always been true. That's why he didn't win the popular vote in 2016, and he's done nothing to expand it and everything to lose that. And people who don't pay attention to politics, who make up their mind late, are watching death and destruction all around them. And there is no way Trump is not going to be blamed for that.
Yeah. Where they would I guess normally they'd be ignoring what's going on now. Anyway,
but his base.
But now there's something
our
to do but
emails.
Watch.
None of that is going to matter, folks.
I sure hope not. It would be hard to believe that we could get over this news and then get past it and get back to stuff like, emails and Burisma. Sure.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, they are trying mightily.
Right. Now, Matthew Zeitlin, who's a reporter who's been around, wrote this morning something I think which is true, sort of. He said it's the savviest, most voracious readers, like your listeners, you, that get the most mad at outlets for normalizing Trump, carrying press conferences, not saying lie in headlines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But it's really a lament that these institutions aren't powerful enough to be real gatekeepers, even if they wanted to. Well, it's true. I'd rather have the New York Times as the gatekeeper than Trump. I'd rather they put the lid on these ridiculous press conferences that are campaign rallies that ought not to be done live. The last 3, there was no news at all.
A lot of complaints about that, and because they were true.
So people broke away from it on cable, but, cable needs stuff. So when you run out of stories, you got to go find some other one. And what do they go find in this particular case? They're going to cover these rallies. The New York Times has it on their front page on the web. And, the rallies are there for like 12 hours, and then they're gone.
The rallies themselves last that long, or
no,
the coverage?
The news, because it's like the one shiny object coverage, but then after that, now it's so interesting.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, what they're going to cover now is this is the 4th one they've done, Congress nears deal for small business aid. Mm-hmm. States plead for testing.
Yes.
There should be some testing monies in there. The Democrats wanted to give some relief for cities and states so they don't go bankrupt. And Trump didn't want that money in there because he wanted to pressure them to open up because he wants them to die and he wants you to die. And don't forget that when you go vote. But that's going to be today's story, not Trump's press conference.
Okay. I hope not.
And it's important because Trump lives for the 24-hour news cycle. He doesn't think about the next day or anything after that. He's only trying to win that hour.
Right.
And that's why, because he can't have his rallies, and this is all therapy for him, he's got to have these news conferences. And we should recognize that and cover it as such, which means send somebody there, write down what he says, vet it, and then tell us a little bit about it later.
Yeah.
If you want, you can even make a video of the crazy and then show us that on the news.
True also.
But don't sanitize it.
Yes, that's true. And for anybody who worries, well, this should be seen by the American people. C-SPAN's got it. That's the way I see it every time.
You don't have to watch everything. They didn't cover everything Obama did. There's no reason why you have to cover everything that he says just because he wants you to.
Yeah. And when, because so long as Congress is out of session, C-SPAN's going to cover it. And then I guess when they come back in, if they come back in, they'll put it on C-SPAN 3. So it'll be there. It'll be covered. We don't need the networks to spend their time with that necessarily. I
was a pain in the neck to work with for 30 years or even longer. Because every time somebody would come to me and say, well, the boss wants this, and I would look at them and say, well, what's that got to do with me?
Well, that's nice.
It's a stupid idea. I'm not doing that.
Yeah, okay. It's important to have goals set in mind. That's good.
It
for
is.
you,
I like
boss.
that. I'll work with them, but this is a dumb one. I'm not doing that. It's not happening. Well, everybody has to wear white coats. I'm in pediatrics. Ain't happening. Yes, but I'm telling you, it's not happening. Okay? The kids don't like white coats. Not happening.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not
sure. Yeah, well, you have to wear a tie.
Why?
They
Why
pull the tie. It's not happening.
They sneeze on it.
Yes, but it's our policy. We have a dress code. That's very nice. Psychiatry and pediatrics are exempt, and if they're not, they will be the next time you revise it.
Okay. but
because patients in both of our areas pull on stuff.
Yeah. Well, do they sell ties? Is that what the problem was? Probably not.
I have no idea. It's just the stupidest. Well, we have to have rules because somebody made up the idea that we have to have rules, and so this is a rule because,
it's a rule right here.
All the suits and skirts come in dressed up like this, and so you have to as well because we have to project an image.
All right, then you have to wear a stethoscope.
Yeah, exactly.
Should have tried that one. All right. Well, I guess people are weird. They have their ways of thinking about these things and approaching them, I suppose. And I know, they're in the news gathering business. News could happen at any moment.
Sure. You know what? I have a great idea, suits and skirts. Why don't we drop you off on the psychiatric ward with your choker necklace and we'll learn why it's called that.
Yikes. All right. Well, they're not very smart. They sit at the desks and do other things. They're probably good at that even. Maybe.
Right. Trump says that you have to. So what?
True.
Just because he says it doesn't mean you have to follow it. Just what is wrong with you?
I have a little meme about that, and I use that little the little ASCII art of the guy peeking out from behind the wall and saying "Psst," and saying you don't have to listen to Trump.
Or narrator voice. That's the one I like.
Yeah. I like
the narrator said, "Actually, you didn't have to listen."
Right. Yeah. But I like the little pictures, their attention getting, and I tweet that all the time. Don't listen. I use different language, but, forget Trump. Don't listen to that guy. Just don't go.
Right.
If you're not ready to go, don't go.
And may I just add, psychiatry is a really difficult job, especially inpatient psychiatry.
Yes.
And it's so difficult
How
that
difficult is it?
basically everybody else in the hospital doesn't even want to go there if they don't have to.
Yeah, well, sure.
Right?
Probably.
You don't want to consult up there. You don't want. You just don't want to go. And so, all respect for the people who do that.
Yeah, tough work.
But you really don't want to be there with jewelry or other ties or other things that people can pull on, because they will.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Somebody will.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same with the kids, although not quite the same way. The kids aren't trying
Yes.
to hurt you. And then the psychiatric patients aren't necessarily trying to hurt you either. But
maybe.
they will, because they
By
just
accident.
can't help themselves.
That's
So,
weird.
those rules don't apply. And there's other rules that certainly don't apply and shouldn't apply as well. So no disrespect, man. I'm going to finish with this David Frum piece
Oh, no. All right.
from The Atlantic. The Atlantic has had an amazingly good run of articles about coronavirus. This one is an opinion piece, but they've had some practical pieces as well. Trump's 2 horrifying plans for dealing with the coronavirus by David Frum. If he can't confine the suffering to his opponents, he's prepared to incite a culture war to distract his supporters.
Yeah.
And that's basically what's happening with these souped-up protests here.
Yeah,
Right?
I think so.
Let's distract your supporters by getting you all to do something that you can all rally around, because we can't have our rallies.
Right.
And the fact that new information published in, let's see, is this
newspaper.
one? It's in Nature. The temporal dynamics and viral shedding and transmissibility of COVID-19 basically show from data developed in China that you're most transmissible like the day before you have symptoms, just like the flu. That happens in the
is that
flu
right
as
with
well.
the flu? But the
So you could
flu
transmit
times less.
while you're asymptomatic is the point.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've heard all about that.
So then you go to this protest. I don't feel bad. Why shouldn't I go? What's the problem?
What's the difference?
We should be opening up. I don't feel bad. Right. Let's see what happens in a week.
Yeah, I know. We
have
have
to start
to wait.
watching
It's tough.
about now what's happening in Wisconsin after the vote.
True. Hopefully
That was done
everybody.
in much more controlled fashion, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully everybody kind of weathers that, because good people standing out there to vote.
Right.
But I did see, maybe you saw, there's somebody's circulating a picture of a flyer for one of the rallies that specifically says, "If you're sick, come anyway." You're right.
I can't tell whether that's artisanally
All I'm saying
ironic.
is it's being circulated.
I can't tell. It's the internet. I don't know. Abraham Lincoln quote on the internet clearly points out, "Don't believe anything on the internet," signed by Abraham Lincoln. So I don't know, but it's scary because there are people that think that way.
Yes.
Anyway, today's Rona articles, the COVID-19 vaccine development in Nature, how it kills you if you're interested in Science magazine.
Sure.
And how it spreads
Kills you
asymptomatically. These are all important pieces that give you an idea of what's going on if you want to follow that. But today, we decided to do the politics, because if we can't control the politics on this, then how it kills you is going to be that much more important. And if we can control the politics on this a little better, then we can enact policy. And again, we've said for years on the show, a lot of us are interested in politics because we're interested in policy. And politics is the only way to get policy done.
Yes.
And they're kind of proving that right now.
Yes, they're helping us with that one. True. But we've had an interesting weekend, a good mix, I thought, and you have to break it down one way or another. I guess Wednesday we can cover the rest of the stuff unless things go even more crazy. But yeah, the science has been a big deal this weekend as well as the big television show, which distracted everybody too. And I thought was good. As the timing worked out, it was good counter programming to the protests. That on the one hand you have the gun nuts and your perennial weirdos who will show up for any sort of protest. On the one hand, they got a lot of coverage. They got as much media coverage as the rest of the world. When every celebrity in the world went on every broadcast network in the nation and said, "Stay home. That's the only sensible thing to do." So hopefully that met, and I guess with 70-80% of the country saying, yeah, that's what we'd rather do. If your favorite celebrities, or even the ones you hate, and you're enjoying watching them stream live from their homes, often with no hair, makeup, and special lighting and everything, and on the same lousy microphones that you have on your laptop at home or whatever. You know what? We had you and I have better microphones than 90% of the celebrities on that show. Apparently. Singers all had really good ones, but
yeah. That's the way it works. But invest in a good microphone if you're going to try this at home. That's that's actually advice David gave me, and it turns out to be really, really true. Yeah,
people like it. You sound better, and it works. And I bet I should have bought stock in microphone companies before this thing. Except I can't buy any stock in anything. So, but I could have also bought. I thought about that too, the webcams and the microphones. But I missed the boat on that one. But then they crashed anyway, so what's the difference?
So, just like my computer. All righty. Okay. Well, anyway, I'm glad we fixed our internet problem. Skype seems to be working just fine. We have the Google Hangout as a backup.
Yes.
I don't want to do Teams and all the other stuff that you have to do from Microsoft if you don't have to. I know it's out there. I don't want to do Zoom.
I think they're pushing us to that.
It's out there.
But we'll wait until 2024 to do that.
Yeah, I suppose.
However long it takes.
Anyway, that's the Monday roundup for today, and I'll be back on Wednesday, and I have a feeling stuff will happen between now and then, and we'll cover it, we'll go over it, and we'll see what happens.
I agree. The lines don't move. There's always news.
Yeah, sometimes even the polls that don't move, though. So we'll talk about it if it happens. Take care, and I'll talk to you on Wednesday.
All right. Thank you. You do the same. We'll see you then, and I'll continue on with our little roundup here, some of the other odds and ends that I was reminded of. But yeah, a lot of science over the weekend. I did read a lot of that, and I spent more time with the New England Journal of Medicine than I thought I was going to because of that crazy story. The Theodore Roosevelt continues to be in the news. We brought it up on Friday. I'm sure we probably discussed it then. There's just this very interesting opportunity to follow the course of the infection and on board and learn a lot about how the virus moves and how quickly and what are the results when you can capture an entire population that's been more or less isolated and yet still had the virus circulate among them and their military, as we discussed on Friday, and you can actually enforce the idea of I'm going to test every single one of you and I'm going to do it a lot of times, right? It hurts the current testing regime, or I guess the previous testing regime, now being replaced largely with other testing regimes that collect their samples differently, but it was very uncomfortable, and apparently you had to stick that long swab all the way up somebody's nose, and you're in all sorts of places that nobody wants anything going on, including swabbing, and apparently it's because of where the infection manifests, and you got to get deep in there, and no one wants to do it once, let alone twice or 3 times for follow-up testing. But I guess if you're in the military, they can say, I order you to do this thing which is going to hurt a little bit, and you have to do it. So, as opposed to, well, I'm not going to show up at the doctor and get my follow-up study. Anyway, so it's been really interesting watching this thing and watching the reporting and hearing, of course, also that Captain Crozier may be reinstated. So there's that, the politics of that floating around, which is also pretty interesting. We haven't heard much about how he's doing. We did hear the other week that he too had contracted coronavirus, and I saw him briefly mentioned in one piece that was circulating over the past couple of days that mentioned him as being ill and fighting the coronavirus, but it didn't say how seriously he had it, so hopefully not that bad. The big news at the end of the week, of course, was that they had tested everybody on board the Roosevelt, and what did they have? About 4,800 crew members. They tested them all. They had about 94% of the test results in, and they had learned that there were, the figure they gave us, the closest they came to putting a real number on it, was over 600 who had been tested and found to be positively carrying or found positive, that is to say, carrying the coronavirus. But the big news was that 60% of them were reported at the time as being asymptomatic. And there was lots of debate at that time and over the weekend over whether or not the people are more properly described as asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. I think, though, we might be getting to the point in time where it might become safe to say that they are in fact asymptomatic. If all the data on the virus and the way it spreads and manifests itself turns out to be accurate. So I think just for, well, here's what I'll do here. I've got the latest reporting on it. Well, the latest on the science that I've seen anyway comes from livescience.com and has more detail. There are later reports, but I don't think that they advanced the ball any on this one, except that this is 5 days old now, written, by the way, by Stephanie Pappas, Pappas, from Live Science. So 5 days ago, their subheader puts it as at least 585 sailors now have COVID-19 and one has died. No one else has died, thankfully, since then, but I understand that there are more sailors hospitalized now and in intensive care, but thankfully no additional ones have died. Of course, we know about more than 600 now, and I have one other article that puts the number at 660 something, nearly 670 sailors. So I think the total's rising, and we could expect more infections for sure, and presumably more symptomatic infections as well, but hopefully the 60% asymptomatic figure holds. That was exciting to a lot of people, though it's a little premature to celebrate just yet. But it was exciting because people thought, oh, well, 60% asymptomatic may mean that we're able to build herd immunity after all in this thing at some point now, and at some cost as well. Don't forget, there are 300 and something sailors who are ill with this, and there may be more, and one has already died. And so, yeah, it's not like you can just let the virus run rampant and everyone will get immunity eventually, and there's no particular cost to it in the way that you would think of, for instance, with some sort of common cold, which is likewise caused very often by a coronavirus, not this one, but a different one. And because the effects aren't severe and you usually won't be losing people along the way, and there's very little you can do about it. We wouldn't shut down the country over a common cold. Now that resonates in a bad way with the excuses people are using with respect to flu season. They say, we don't shut down every year for flu season. I think by now we all know the reasons why the comparison is no good. But anyway, back over to Live Science, because I think they have some interesting insight into the timeline, as well as some interesting thoughts and a few curveballs in trying to figure this whole thing out. They still need to know, well, where did this thing come from? And remember, we're talking about a ship at sea. So you would think, and people, I don't know, a lot of people are asking, how many other ships, if you can get this on deployment while you're in the Navy, and your ship is isolated from everything out in the middle of the ocean, what's happening here? And by the way, there are other carriers out there, and I don't know if this article mentions them, but apparently aboard the Nimitz and the Ronald Reagan and one other of the giant carriers out there, there is a COVID presence, but I don't think they're in as much trouble as the Roosevelt got itself into. But of course, it's theorized, they got a working theory, that the Roosevelt docked, they paid a port call on March 5th in Da Nang, Vietnam, and the theory is that's where sailors picked it up while they were on shore leave, and they have it all. Well, let's dive into real science and see what they've got for us. The story of an aircraft carrier beset by coronavirus reveals how quickly SARS-CoV-2 spreads in close quarters and how typical procedures fail in a time of pandemic. A new New York Times analysis into the case of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a naval warship with nearly 5,000 crew aboard, illuminates how rapidly the disease spread, outpacing the naval hierarchy's ability to respond. The Captain of the ship, Brett E. Crozier, wrote a desperate letter to other naval personnel in the Pacific asking for help. He knew the letter would end his career, sources told the Times. After the letter was published by the San Francisco Chronicle, Crozier was removed from his post. We know, actually, most of this part. Perhaps we should skip ahead to the Roosevelt, in the meantime, has been cleared of its crew, and I saw elsewhere it was reported that they're about 80% done with sanitizing the ship, whatever that might mean at this point. Crozier tested positive for coronavirus and remains in Guam fighting COVID-19. Another 585 sailors from the Roosevelt, now up to, nearing 700 probably by now, have also tested positive, and one has died. According to the New York Times, one sailor remains in intensive care in Guam. The virus likely came aboard the ship in Da Nang, Vietnam, where the Roosevelt paid a port call on March 5th. Some sailors spent a night in a hotel where two British nationals, who later tested positive for the coronavirus, also stayed. Good clue there, right? There were also military flights from Pacific bases onto the ship to deliver supplies in the following weeks, which is another potential source of viral transmission, and one that we haven't talked much about. That was a new one on me, so I wanted to add that to the mix. On March 24th, that is, 19 days after they pay their port call at Da Nang, the ship went into communications lockdown after 3 crew members tested positive for SARS-CoV-2. That's, of course, the scientific name for the new coronavirus. Those crew members were flown to Guam at that point. The ship followed, docking near Guam on March 26th. Navy officials debated their response, with Crozier arguing for a nearly complete evacuation of the ship and higher-ups arguing for keeping most crew aboard. Not certain why, but I can imagine that sensible higher-ups might have been concerned about the impact on Guam, and I think that's fair. But yeah, evacuating the ship, I think, sounded like the thing to do after all. So we heard about Captain Crozier and what happened to him and why he wanted the ship evacuated and cleaned, and I think that the science and the history will bear him out. I just wanted to add those 2 or 3 new points to this, and we'll finish up with it after the break. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with this live science piece here. I think that was maybe the more one of the more interesting pieces on the situation in the Roosevelt to come out in the last couple of days. So where we left off was Crozier sent his letter on March 30th explaining his reasons and what he wanted to do. Sailors aboard the Roosevelt, of course, he explained, sleep in bunks 2 or 3 high. Eat in communal mess halls and share bathrooms. Social distancing is just not possible. He, in his letter, wrote about it, I think, in more jargony terms. You want to hear some of those? The only effective method to preserve an individual's health is total isolation for 14 plus days in accordance with NAVADMIN, that is Naval Administrative Message, i.e. individual hotel/barracks rooms with separate heads, which is, of course, what Navy people call the bathrooms. Due to a warship's inherent limitations of space, they got to have room for all the bombs and stuff. You know how that works. We are not doing this. The spread of the disease is ongoing and accelerating. So, the captain's situation, the article continues, was reminiscent of the Diamond Princess, the cruise ship that was quarantined near Yokohama, Japan, in February after coronavirus ran rampant among crew and passengers. Of the 3,711 passengers and crew aboard, 712 tested positive for the coronavirus, according to the CDC. So how did they do? They have fewer people aboard and more positives, so their infection rate should be considerably higher than it was on the Roosevelt, although I don't know how long they had to cook things up there. Let's see. They had 712 positives out of 3,711, so 19% versus, I think, a 12.5% we got. As a matter of fact, it's 1918, 19.18%. Although I guess since the next digit is a 6, you would round up to 1919. But they still had the flu then anyway. So it'll work just fine. So, all right. So they had a higher rate. Oh, look. An estimated... and they have a asymptomatic number for the Diamond Princess, too. So that's important for those of you following the science of things here. An estimated, much lower number, 17.9% of those people were asymptomatic, highlighting another challenge of the coronavirus at sea. It's impossible to tell by symptoms alone who is sick and spreading the disease. Compounding that, preliminary research has suggested that people with the virus might be most infectious when they have only mild symptoms, Live Science previously reported. Or as Greg had it earlier, that you seem to be the most contagious the day before you develop symptoms, or perhaps the day before you develop more serious symptoms anyway. But one or the other of those, they indicate much the same thing. That this virus is a little sneaky that way. And while apparently it's also true of the standard flu, I think the incubation period is much shorter, and you start to feel lousy faster and take yourself out of circulation sooner. But if you are able to walk around, even if you're only pre-symptomatic, walk around for 2 weeks with the virus in you, multiplying and shedding, that's what makes this so different, even though there are still people out there who can't believe that there's any difference at all and refuse to see it. I don't know why that is, but they do. Now, the Diamond Princess had a much lower rate of asymptomatic positives, I guess, and that may have something to do. That may be where it makes a difference that you're talking about a Navy ship where the population, the captive population there, is for the most part much younger and healthier than, I would imagine, the passengers of a cruise ship, who tend to skew a little older. Now, moving on here, a study of the Diamond Princess's transmission dynamics, published online February 29th in the journal Infectious Disease Modeling. It's not about models. It's, the Trump kind, in case you were wondering, in case Donald Trump is listening. Anyway, the study suggests that each person carrying the coronavirus could have infected around 7 people and up to 11 right before quarantine within rooms was implemented. And we discover another problem aboard the Diamond Princess here in this paragraph too. This was higher than land-based estimates, which put the viral reproductive number at 5.7 in Wuhan before the city locked down, which means at that particular time, each infected person was infecting about 5.7 others with the virus. Makes sense if you have a planet to walk around on, or, at least a large city, you're going to have some natural distancing between yourself and others occasionally, whereas on board an aircraft carrier, you're almost never alone for any reason, and you're going to infect more people. Or rather, not even an aircraft carrier, a cruise ship. Same thing, though. You're stuck on a boat. You can't get away from other people. You're going to infect more of them. On the Diamond Princess, crew members, this is the problem. Crew members working in food service seem to have been a route for the virus to spread, one that continued after passengers were quarantined in their cabins, an investigation found. Well, why? This was because passengers continued to have contact with food delivery crews, right? You're quarantined in your room. They have to feed you. They can't just starve you there, although a lot of people complained that they weren't getting adequate food. Who's delivering it? Crew members. Are the crew members sick? Maybe, maybe not. Are they carrying the virus? Yes, they are. This, of course, poses a particular problem. If you're getting your food from a sick crew member or an asymptomatic positive crew member. Aboard the Roosevelt, of course, sailors did not even have the luxury of private cabins. And according to the Times, the catastrophe aboard the Roosevelt may be a warning for the military. Sailors on, here's the info, 3 other carriers. The Ronald Reagan, seems appropriate. The Carl Vinson, I think I've actually heard of that one. And the Nimitz have tested positive for the coronavirus. So we got our eyes on those. Somewhere in pocket, I put away and then buried under a flurry of other stories. There's another, yes, other navies and other militaries are suffering from the same problem. There's an article from The Guardian that I grabbed just to establish that fact. Inquiry underway, I guess, after 668 of French aircraft carriers' crew catch coronavirus. Amazingly, pretty close to the same number of positives as between the Roosevelt and the French aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle. They have a smaller crew, so it's a bigger deal. The subheader here notes that military has ordered an investigation into how 1/3 of the sailors on board the ship have become infected. So they're getting it at a greater rate. But by the way, just before I even move into this, just so we're clear on the facts that I culled out of the Live Science article. Once again, the timeline is March 5th, port call in Da Nang. March 24th is when they get their first positive testing sailors on board, and they evacuate these three and fly them to Guam. I floated some ideas and some initial thoughts about that on Twitter, where I was reminded thereafter that it is not necessarily the case that the three sailors who first presented as coronavirus positive, CoV-2 positive, were the first ones infected. That was my first assumption, but it could absolutely have been the case that someone else picked up the virus, several picked up the virus and were asymptomatic and passed it on to these three who did not have the good fortune to be entirely asymptomatic, but were the first ones who presented as ill. And by that time, by March 24th, or I guess we don't know when they started complaining of symptoms. We only know when they tested positive and were evacuated. But presumably they reported to, I don't know, do they actually call it sick bay on board the ship, and said, yeah, I feel terrible. And at that time, I guess probably the medical staff there, they were certainly aware of the coronavirus, but I don't know whether they had tests on board. They probably had to say, we got to get some tests like flown on board the ship here and test these guys and see if that's what we're really dealing with. So there's probably some number of days during which these people were ill and everybody suspected coronavirus, but they couldn't confirm it. But then on the 24th, they must have gotten the tests, performed them, figured it out, diagnosed them, and flew them off. And the Roosevelt then reaches Guam and docks on March 26th. It isn't until March 30th the captain actually writes his letter. So there's about 3 weeks, a little under 3 weeks, between the port call and the first positive. So that either means if the first positives were in fact the first ones infected, that this took almost 3 weeks to manifest itself in symptoms. But it may be the fact that it only took, in fact, 2 weeks, and then they didn't feel bad enough to go to sick bay, and then they did, and then they sat there knowing they probably had the coronavirus but couldn't confirm it until those tests got flown in. That could explain the 3 weeks. It really was 2 plus some waiting for the tests. Or the other theory being that the disease manifested itself much more quickly and they caught it instead from one of the resupply flights from the Pacific ports that landed on board. So they really have to track that down. And it may also mean, though, if this is really taking 2 weeks to manifest itself, it certainly leaves open the possibility that some of the people who have not displayed any symptoms aren't in fact asymptomatic on a permanent basis, but are just pre-symptomatic at the moment that the survey of the sailors and their current state of health was taken. So we'll have to, there we have a wait and see. And we've got another sample out there to watch, and we're not keeping an eye on it. I hadn't heard anything about it, and I was embarrassed to find out that no one in America was paying attention to the plight of this French aircraft carrier, though I understand worldwide there was attention on the Theodore Roosevelt. We're just always in the spotlight, I guess, here in America, and so we're usually blind to the rest of the world. But that's what's going on. Once again, here, I'll give you a little taste of what's happening in the Guardian article. The French military has ordered an inquiry into how a third of the crew on its Navy's flagship, the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, contracted the coronavirus. The nuclear-powered vessel had reportedly had no contact with the outside world since it went to sea on March 15th. But, that could certainly explain it. By March 15th, I don't know where they were. If they put to sea from France, there was certainly coronavirus in circulation there. But March 15th is pretty early in terms of heading out to sea and then being isolated. So, last Friday, which would have been when? This is datelined Thursday the 16th. So, a week ago last week's Friday, the French Defense Ministry confirmed 50 sailors had COVID-19, and the ship, which was in the Atlantic at the time, was ordered back to base in Toulon and France's Mediterranean coast. Don't know how my pronunciation is on that one. It arrived on Sunday, 2 weeks earlier than planned. Since then, 668 sailors, 1/3 of the 1,767 strong crew, have tested positive, the French Defense Ministry confirmed. Today, 31 of them are in the hospital, 1 in intensive care. We do not have results for 30% of the tests, it said in a statement. The crew members have been placed in isolation for 14 days before being allowed to rejoin their families. Operations to disinfect the vessel and aircraft have begun, said the French Defense Minister, Florence Parly, who added a message of support for the confined sailors and their families. The Charles de Gaulle was docked at Brest on France's western coast between March 13th and March 15th, where the sailors were given shore leave. This was 2 days before the country's strict confinement, as the lockdown is known in France. So, clearly they picked it up there and then headed to sea, and they were out for, how long? I guess, let's see, if they went to sea on March 15th and then last Friday, which at this point, I just want to go and take a look at the calendar so we can dissect this as we're going on. Let's see, last Friday was the 17th. The last Friday they were referencing here in the article was April 10th. So on April 10th, they said they had 50 confirmed COVIDs at the time, but that might be just because that's how many tests they did. But from March 15th to April 10th, they're sailing around and the virus is spreading, and at some point they figure it out, turn around and head back, and then a week after they had tested 50, they went ahead and tested everybody else, and then they found out that they had a third of the crew sick. I don't think it necessarily means that they went from 50 to 668 in a week. They probably had, 400 of those 668 when they thought they only had 50. They just ran out of tests. So we're still waiting on word from how many of them may be asymptomatic. What does this all mean? I don't know. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not even a doctor of any other kind either. Well, I guess I have a Juris Doctor degree, but that's not going to help us in this situation. We'll have to talk about it a little more with Greg. But I do have this very interesting article while we're on the topic of asymptomatic carriers. And I can't evaluate the article's scientific content. I probably couldn't do it even if it was in a medical journal, but I would be able to rely on a medical journal's vetting in order to stand in for my own inability to interpret the results. So we'll venture off of that safe space and into the wilds of the internet, just to say I've found this other interesting piece by somebody who may or may not know what the hell they're talking about, but appears to be in the medical field. Let me see whether the about page tells us anything about this guy here. Not immediately. But what does Google tell me about him? Anything? Just maybe I ought to do that. Anyhow, I'm on a website which, where am I? I am on empathy.guru. That tells me nothing about the reliability of the information I'm looking at, but I will say this made a certain amount of common sense to me. Anyway, it's written by a guy by the name of Charles Pezeshki. And a quick Google there brings me to, where am I? WSU School of Mechanical and Materials Engineering. So I don't know whether he's also got a medical background. I could tell by scanning down here. It's Washington State University, by the way. A lot of important things going on there in virology, but that was the University of Washington. But I assume perhaps some cross-pollination perhaps going on there, since they were one of the early hotspots. But Charles Pezeshki, professor and director of industrial design. And sometimes these sort of systems people have a very interesting view of the way things work here. They're not epidemiologists, but their understanding of systems and processes gives them an interesting perspective on all this stuff. Let's see, but just by way of educational background here, he's got his PhD in mechanical engineering. So he's an engineer by background. That does sometimes help in all this. But let me tell you what he has to say, which I thought was of interest. He's writing here under the title of Understanding the Dark Matter of the COVID-19 Pandemic, Why Detecting Asymptomatic Cases Matters. We all have a sense about the fact that they matter, and most of us come away, I think, with the general understanding, well, if there are people who are asymptomatic, maybe we can draw blood from them and make some sort of, if not a vaccine, then, use a serum-based treatment, if I understand the terminology correctly, to give people the antibodies that it takes to fight off the virus, even if we can't do the usual, if we're not yet ready to go the usual vaccination route, which usually entails injecting a weakened form of the virus into your bloodstream so that your body can produce those antibodies by itself. If we can't do that, perhaps we can just give you the antibodies from others. So everybody has been interested in asymptomatic cases, but this is a very interesting and different perspective on why, and I thought I would share it with you. Disclaimer up at the top, right here, it says, this piece is intended as an exploration of the deep OS, the operating system, get it, of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is hoped that by more deeply understanding the dynamics of how humans process knowledge of the pandemic, we will more quickly and effectively restore civil society. And it's a possible lead in all of this, and an interesting approach. So it doesn't claim to be a medical journal or a medical article, just totally different approach. And maybe that's, something we need here. As we are now a solid 6 weeks into the COVID-19 pandemic, this was written, by the way, on April 8th, so I guess we're even further in, we still have a poor idea of how all this is going to end. To read the papers, as well as listen to many experts, all of them are predicting 12 to 18 months, with most of this spent in lockdown. Not all, but many certainly. Essentially, until a vaccine, which they also predict will take 12 to 18 months to develop, is tested and deployed. This is a safe scientific position predicated on past practice. This is also a perilous socio-political position to take, because there is almost no way that a society, regardless of how you feel about the virus, whether you think it's a conspiratorial scourge or an actual, real, live, deadly threat. But regardless of how you feel about the virus, there's almost no way a society will stay locked down inside our houses for that amount of time. Already you're seeing the protests, for instance. What such predictions actually do is increase the potential of a loss of authority of government, where people will do whatever they think they should, regardless of the consequences. This is already happening with more extreme elements of right-wing groups like the Bundy family, who already faced down federal agents with guns over grazing rights adjacent to their land in Nevada. And I do believe that the impact of a pandemic will be far worse without coordinated action. Additionally, I do believe that if we understand the dynamics of the pandemic and how societies achieve larger herd immunity, we can manage impacts as we move along. There's herd immunity being mentioned again. And as I hinted at earlier, a lot of people were excited about the idea of 60% asymptomatic on the Roosevelt, because apparently part of the theory of asymptomaticity, which I think is a word that he uses in here, and I got to get that pronunciation right, and herd immunity, I guess 60% is about the minimum you might need for some pathogens to be able to claim genuine herd immunity. Others, however, and the fear is that this might be one of them, would require more like 80% asymptomaticity, if that's the correct pronunciation. And we don't know which one this one really is yet. But continuing on here, additionally, as he said, I do believe if we understand the dynamics of the pandemic and how societies achieve larger herd immunity, we can manage impacts as we move along. One person who will continue to read the public mood will be our pathological narcissist in chief. This is how you wouldn't get yourself into a medical journal, but it's true. Who will pronounce whatever he feels needs to be announced to maintain his status with his base. As I've written before, narcissistic personalities have a super radar that enables them to read the national mood. I'm not certain it's always a correct read, but okay. And while Democrats might feel ennobled sticking up for people like Dr. Fauci, and rational people should listen to him, I do, with draconian timelines, there's a strong possibility that the Democrats will essentially throw the November election to Trump. Well, it's not a political analysis. We'll say that. The correct, I mean, it's par for the course, being afraid that could happen. No different than most people. The correct higher level strategy, he argues, to create has got to leverage two things. One is a deep understanding of viral epidemics. I don't know if we've got that or not. And how populations achieve herd immunity through asymptomatic filling of populations in general, as well as this one in particular. The second is the need to adopt an observe, orient, decide, act strategy. That would be OODA, what he calls here an OODA loop. Again, observe, orient, decide, act, and develop a strategy for particular actions in uncertain times. While it may appeal to offer short-term gain by announcing long-time reopening strategies, that they offer care and concern for citizens, the reality is that such long-term strategies actually offer lots of avenues for long-term failure and embarrassment. That's certainly true. I mean, it certainly sounds like the smart, safe thing to do scientifically is to wait a long, long time before we reopen. But if you want to minimize the spread of the virus, you should at some point, like we say, red team this thing and figure out that there are going to be, there may be outliers, but the numbers may grow too. There are going to be people who ignore the advice or implement it poorly. And we need to look out for that. And what does it mean? And what can we do? Do we change strategies to something that's suboptimal if everyone's following directions? So if we change to something that's suboptimal because we believe they won't follow those directions, but assuming that they won't, this usually less than desirable path turns out to be the one with the least casualties involved. That's basically the question being asked here. We're going to run up to our break here in just a minute or so, but we'll keep reading and we'll continue on the other side here. So, where were we? We are learning about how our modern society reacts to this type of situation as we roll along. And our top political figures need to learn how to embrace this. The minute we lose the ability to incorporate new knowledge along a moving timeline, not only the virus will beat us, but we'll likely get 4 more years of Trump, his persistent worry here. And that would be disastrous on many fronts, especially for those of us wishing for a more coherent federal narrative. And we'll say we're not going to get much further than this before our break, but I'll come back and we'll set aside the political analysis and get into the systems analysis and some of the interesting perspective he has for you after this. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. Let's continue with this very interesting article and this very interesting source, empathy.guru, whatever that may be. I promise you there's some things that I think are good thoughts that we want to take away with us here. I can't vouch for them medically, of course. And it may be that they just exist sort of outside of that framework, but it's something to think about and offers up a possibility for a way of thinking about perhaps the necessity and perhaps a methodology for reopening at least parts of the economy and maybe reaching some sort of accommodation, not with the lunatic protesters, but certainly with, I think, a mood clearly that they've tapped into. Most people don't agree with them, but certainly I would venture to guess that there's a willingness to entertain the question of, all right, well, what does a reopening look like whenever we can get to it, no matter how long it takes to get there? What are we going to do? What is the plan? Because the president has presented nothing. He's got a slide that, as Bill pointed out over the weekend, is essentially the underpants gnome theory. We're just going to open, then something happens, and then profit. And that's really all we got about that one. So, okay. Continuing on here. There are many reasons for more optimistic timelines in reopening our society. That's nice. One, people like Bill Gates are building simultaneous vaccine factories. That doesn't encourage the protesters, of course, who believe it is a joint effort of Bill Gates and Satan to develop mind control serums of some kind and inject us with something that's going to make us all buy Microsoft products. That would be called oxygen, and we all end up having to depend on Microsoft products for just because we're alive, unfortunately. But anyway, leaving that aside, there is the possibility of a better combination of antiviral medications. True. But the biggest is the timeline of systemic evolution of the virus itself. And the largest part of that systemic evolution is our understanding of how populations with asymptomatic characteristics evolve immunity over time. Indeed. How do we get that? How can I have that? Can I jab myself with a pin of some kind and get it? Why should you care about asymptomatic COVID-19 carriers? One thing that is coming to the fore that I discussed in this past piece, which he links and I have not yet read, is the effect of dose on whether one gets the full-blown death COVID experience. That's not a medical term, obviously. But what is he talking about here? A far higher percentage of healthcare professionals get the bad COVID and die. Now, what are we talking about here? the bad COVID. I guess they get it very badly and get an acute case of it. And he's suggesting that that has to do perhaps with the dose of the germs, essentially, that they get and how they get them. A far higher percentage of healthcare professionals are getting it and dying. That we know. We also have immunocompromised individuals who also, when they get the disease, are far more likely to die. All this makes sense inside a larger narrative. Healthy people need a bigger dose to overwhelm their immune systems. Unhealthy people need a lesser dose. As he puts it here, what consists of a dose? Or rather, I would say, what does a dose consist of? But anyway, no one can answer that question at this time. But once again, there are things we know. Coughing and spraying creates droplets that contain the virus. The bigger the droplets, the larger the number of viruses inside the droplet by the volume cube law. But what that tells us is that virus spreaders are not primarily the asymptomatic. And I know we've heard an awful lot about it, and we did hear that there might be more viral shedding from the asymptomatic than the symptomatic, and that they certainly pose a danger to us all. But I think even the science bears this statement out at its most basic level anyway. The virus spreaders are primarily not asymptomatic. We heard a very high number associated with them. Last week we discussed, and Greg pointed us to a study that said that something in the order of 44% of infections may in fact trace to having picked up the virus from an asymptomatic carrier. That's a lot, but 44% isn't a majority. So it still stands here. The virus spreaders are not primarily asymptomatic. The ones who are responsible for the most of it, I guess, then, are the ones who are coughing and spraying. And while you can certainly pick up stuff on your hands, remember, wash your hands, right? You're far more likely to get this if you're in the room with someone coughing. All of this stuff is probabilistic at this point, but there are obvious ways of decreasing the odds of getting it. As he says, decreasing your odds. You would increase your odds, but decreasing the odds that you'll get it. Part of this is things that you can do, avoiding exposure and a high enough dose to give you whatever it is for you, the disease. Part of this are things that other people can do, like wearing masks, homemade, hopefully, so that you're not taking up valuable professional grade PPE from those who need it in the clinical setting. In the past couple of days, we have seen some very early encouraging data-driven results regarding asymptomatic statistics for COVID-19. First one I saw, our writer says, was results from a Lombardy, Italy blood bank that showed 70% COVID antibodies in all of the blood collections. Of course, this is anecdotal, but in general, people will not give blood if they think they're sick or have been sick. Another paper here showed and it's a link to this one, a preliminary retrospective on China that showed 80% of people were asymptomatic. That's even higher. And that would argue for, I think, most thresholds for herd immunity at some point. I was sent another paper on influenza asymptomaticity. There, the numbers range from 18 to 25% to a more likely 65 to 85%. The difference being the larger numbers were indicative of a more diverse and heterogeneous population. Asymptomaticity, if the methods of spread are from aerosol or fluid droplet transfer, and most of the studies now pointing more heavily at fluid droplet transfer rather than aerosol. Once again, there are reasons to be optimistic. It means that the virus, much like cowpox inoculated against its more deadly variant, can spread and deliver immunity. And indeed, this is how many vaccines work. A weakened form of the virus is injected in a person whose immune system kicks into gear and delivers protection. Interestingly enough, this is not the first virus to deliver some level of immunity in a larger population after a death spike. I just finished reading Buddy Levy's book, Levy? I don't know. The book is Conquistador, that documents how Cortez conquered the Aztecs. In the middle of the fight for the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, a Spanish slave carrying smallpox into an Indian household was the vector for the disease, which Levy and Jared Diamond document the plague as killing approximately 40% of the population. It's pretty big, but it is hard to pin down the exact percentage dead. Diamond says 40%. But the reality is that there were plenty of Aztecs left to wage a protracted conflict against the Spaniards. What that also means is that one of our deadliest scourges, smallpox, in an urban population, managed also to burn through a population, both symptomatically and asymptomatically, and deliver immune individuals out the other side. Enough, in fact, to disrupt the dynamics of the epidemic. Asymptomaticity is a real thing. It might not be a thing that you necessarily want to risk in the modern day when you know what you can do to cut back on medical damage of all sorts, including death. But that's what some of the people who were, I guess, hearkening back to smallpox and other pandemics thought merited discussion. And in fact, it just really didn't at that point. But, it's in the abstract, you say, well, 40%. So the vast majority, well, even if it's not that vast, will survive and then they'll have herd immunity. Yeah, but still, burying 40% of your population is no joke. And in the modern context, collapse of society. True, there were enough Aztecs left afterwards to wage a protracted conflict against the Spaniards, but, well, they really had no choice in the matter. It was either submit to the Spaniards or wage protracted conflict with the population you have, not the population you wished you had back then. I'm sure they would rather have had 100% of their people available to do that. So the fact that they waged conflict and it was protracted doesn't tell us that much, but I think you get the idea. When you have no choice, which we do now, there is such a thing as herd immunity, but no one wants to do what it takes to get there. Anyway, let's move on because that's not what he's advocating here. That said, asymptomatic spread of immunity is no reason to have chickenpox parties or participate in anti-vaxxer nonsense of any kind. Rather, we need to understand asymptomatic behavior through a different lens. The physicists' notion of dark matter. Yeah, this gets a little interesting. For those that don't know what dark matter is, it's the stuff the universe is made of that is relatively undetectable, but shapes through gravity our galaxies and star systems. I can't vouch for that, the accuracy of that description, but it sounds close to my layman's understanding of what they're talking about when they talk about dark matter. And just like dark matter, asymptomaticity is out there, and we've done a poor job of measuring it. But if we understand it, we can use it to shape strategies for reopening our societies in an incremental OODA loop manner. And remember, the OODA was, what was it? Observe, orient, decide. I can't even remember now. I was going to scroll back up to the top because I want to remind myself of what it was. Observe, orient, decide, act. Okay. So back down to where we were with this one. So incremental reopening strategies. First off, he says, first off is how social distancing and flattening the curve actually benefit the spread of larger society-wide immunity. On the surface, social distancing is cut and dried. You stay 6 feet away from everyone, and regardless of whether you have the virus or someone else does, you're 6 feet away and can't get the virus from them. Now, the reality is that social distancing works in haphazard fashion. First of all, he links to something here in support of this, but he says the 6 foot distance is kind of a guess, but it's not supported by anything resembling real science. So that could be problematic. And I have seen studies that say, well, when people are coughing in particular, yeah, you might need to be, 15 plus feet away to avoid that. But there is a primary benefit of social distancing. That is, it keeps high-dose individuals through public shaming from circulating in society. And here I think we shift a bit in the language here. In this case, a high-dose individual is not somebody who requires a high dose in order to have their immune system overcome and come down with the virus, but rather a person who's carrying a high dose and is capable of delivering virus to others in high doses, whether asymptomatically or not. But it keeps social distancing keeps high dose individuals through public shaming from circulating in society. Everybody is not circulating in society, and everybody knows you can. You're given a permission structure, to use one of Greg's terms, to enforce a 6-foot space between you and everybody else, whether they're known to you as high-dose individuals or not. This was not always the case. We now continue. During the week before spring break at my university, around the beginning of March, COVID was starting to rear its ugly head. We were called into a faculty meeting and told explicitly, remember early days here, we were not allowed to tell any student displaying any COVID symptom to exit our classroom. By that time in my own classes, though, this is interesting, I had built enough social capital and discussed the pandemic enough that no sick students came to class. Yet it was eerie even for me as students started dropping out of my class, I guess meaning that they were sick. One that he flatters himself by saying that always had close to 100% attendance. Whether or not that is true doesn't really matter. But you get the idea. That being, he talked about what was going on out there and how it was contagious and how basically if you're sick, you really ought to stay away from the rest of us. And so when people did start staying away from class, the assumption was that he had done his job, and he also complied with the faculty directive not to tell students who are there displaying symptoms to leave. He told them ahead of time, if you do have symptoms, it's best for everyone if you don't show up in the first place. And that was that worked just the same as the ability that was taken away from them to eject students that show symptoms. Now, what social distancing actually does, causing quarantine of victims displaying active symptoms, is twofold. As mentioned above, one is isolating high-dose individuals from the population, but the other thing is that low-dose individuals are far more likely to continue to circulate, and it gives them more time to do so. Asymptomatic individuals do indeed continue the spread of the virus, but as people wear masks and wash their hands, it inherently reduces the dose of the virus they receive. That gives their immune systems more time to adjust and combat the virus. Isn't that an interesting theory? I mean, it's probably true. It makes a certain amount of sense, right? We'd have to ask a medical doctor whether or not it actually works like that, or an epidemiologist how it works in particular. But the idea being here that people who have low-dose individuals, people who aren't shedding a great deal of the virus and who aren't very ill or ill at all, will circulate among us, yes, but will also be, hopefully now, socially distancing, wearing masks. That means the rest of us who haven't got any presence yet of the virus in our bodies, we may pick it up from them, but we will pick it up thanks to social distancing and masking at a lower rate and a lower dose, and increase the likelihood that those of us who are healthy enough to have functioning immune systems will get it, but get it at a lower dose that our immune systems are capable of producing enough antibodies to combat this low dose successfully. And so we are either asymptomatic or get a very, very mild form of the disease. As we've heard about, a lot of that mild form is out there, and we can get past it. And that is how you might be able to create herd immunity without killing thousands or even millions. The notion of measuring now, you get the idea. I mean, I think that makes a certain amount of sense. That makes common sense anyway, right? If you can expose people to low enough doses so that they come in contact with the virus, but their immune systems are capable of combating it, that's as good as a vaccine. I mean, functionally it works the same way. It's just no needle and it's not intentionally done. So now back to the strange sort of systems theory approach to all this, which I find very interesting. The notion of measuring what isn't there has that asymptomaticity, that is, the symptoms aren't there. The notion of measuring how much of that there is, that has confounded statisticians in the past. And this is the interesting part here. This is a great analogy, I thought. The best example in history, and I mean from history, really, is how we don't know for sure that this is the best example history has ever had to offer, but a good one that comes from history involves one of my heroes, not mine, but the writer's, Abraham Wald. And he's off to a good start with the last name as far as I'm concerned. Wald was given the task of increasing bomber survivability for raids over Germany. I love this story. I read it already. This is one of the few times I've previewed stuff for you. People originally were looking at B-17s, the bombers, World War II, right? And arguing for increasing armor over the bullet holes in returning planes, right? The planes come back from a mission, they've been shot up, and now they have holes in them, and you had to repair the hole. You don't have to repair the holes, but the thought was, well, we ought to repair the holes. And so what do you do? And the argument was, well, we got to patch these things up anyway, but let's put armor here over the extra armor over where the bullet holes are, because after all, we're looking at a live example of where the enemy is firing, where they're hitting our planes. And so if we give them extra armor where they took bullet fire, more of them will return from the missions later. And it was Wald that says, no, the opposite is actually true. It was Wald that argued a metacognitive opposite. There's a nice term of art for you. We need to look at the areas on the returning planes that have no bullet holes and armor those spots. And I'm sure at the time people said, well, why would you do that? They weren't shot there. This is fascinating to me. What a great thought this is. We need to look at the areas on the returning planes that had no bullet holes and armor those spots, as it was likely that the planes that had been shot in those areas were the ones that were not coming back. You don't have a chance to up-armor those, right? Because they got shot down. The planes that didn't make it got shot in different places. If you get shot in these places, you'll survive and land again. If you get shot in the other places, we never see you again. That's a good thought and an interesting illustration of the dark matter theory here. The problem with epidemiologists, similar to my hero Abraham Wald's work with B-17 bombers in World War II, is that we, epidemiologists, have to reframe our efforts to measure the percentage of people who display no symptoms instead of our current situation where we test people. Who are we testing in this country? We can't get tests. There's not enough of them. So we ration them. Who are we using them on? Well, I think, this argument is we made a mistake. It tested the wrong people. We test people who already quite obviously have the disease. This also leads to the notion that the most important testing priority we can have has to be shared between active testing for the disease as well as antibody tests to determine asymptomatic percentages. And they are working on that, of course. But you can see why epidemiologists would be most interested, even though their job is to figure out how to tamp down on the spread. They're most interested at some level in testing the people who are sick so that you can figure out how many people are getting sick, how contagious is the disease, what happens to you when you get it, what is the likelihood that you'll die when you have it, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, there's a good reason to be, unfortunately, we can't produce enough tests, but then we have to find the way to test for antibodies, but there's a good reason to know whether or not, how many people are exposed to it and are carrying the virus but are asymptomatic, and why. So, where were we here? This also leads to the notion that the most important testing priority we can have has to be shared between active testing for the disease as well as antibody tests to determine asymptomatic percentages. What does this information inform? When confined to specific populations, and he has an idea here, like the police, we can understand when population saturation of the pandemic has occurred. And I guess probably also he would argue specific populations like those aboard the aircraft carriers, right? But here he uses the police. As it turns out, New York City police officers, the NYPD, is reporting that about 20% of their population have active symptoms. That's, bad news for like controlling a city, except that the city's in lockdown, so maybe it'll work. Anyway, what this really means is that if the asymptomatic percentages are to be believed, where people are saying, even up to 60, 80% could be asymptomatic, that functionally that would mean every cop has COVID already. It's done with the cops. They may yet continue to die, but everybody's got it. Such information is simply invaluable because now we can create strategies to deal with people in our population who suffer from the fate that any dose is too large, the immunosuppressed. When you accept that every cop has COVID, one now generates protocols and testing for both the cops as well as the immunosuppressed to make sure, regardless of the circumstances, that the disease is not spread to those it will kill. Needless to say, there are other subpopulations we can monitor within the context of protecting the immunosuppressed. And then this also leads us away from large-scale population monitoring for an indefinite future. That would be nice to escape, wouldn't it? Testing of the sick will still matter. There will still be a need for an all clear for a person coming out of quarantine, for instance. But getting a clean bill of health for most nominal circumstances, healthcare workers, of course, will still need to be monitored somehow for dosing limits, which is not happening now. But getting a clean bill of health for most nominal circumstances will allow a pretty dramatic reopening of society, he theorizes. It also informs the weeks necessary for statewide social distancing. Asymptomatic rates at a given level could then be mapped to herd immunity requirements, and then interdiction of individuals with the virus could be scaled back. In a world without resource constraints, we might be able to have a meditative retreat for 12 months in our home. And if some of the more hyperbolic narratives are to be believed, the minute we come out of lockdown, the virus will explode again, so we have no choice but to wait for one past fix that we know can work, a vaccine. But that then asks to sideline much of what we actually know about the spread of the virus, that it mostly floats in aerosols and droplets. We also would have to realize that masks would make no difference, even though there is much evidence in a variety of countries that they do. And I've written this piece, which he links here, on the whole evidence stack for masks. Until we have extensive antibody testing, and it says here parenthetically that Taiwan already has developed the test and is scaling production, we are stuck with the tools we have. But now it may not be so stupid to stop travelers who display a high fever at the border or in an airport. The deep insight of what was going on might not have been part of the decision-making process regarding COVID initially in Asian countries, but it turns out that luck was on their side. And the other part of this, adopting an OODA loop philosophy, is also something we should consider. Singapore went back into lockdown a couple of days ago with the intent of it lasting only a month, yet at the same time, the Prime Minister of Singapore announced larger exemptions for critical industries. All lockdowns are not equivalent, and there is evidence that Singapore is acting far more strategically, in line with the kind of logic I discussed regarding the police above, than a one-size-fits-all solution. The political language then also has to change from one of surety, which we almost certainly do not have, to solidarity. We're all connected together. We share a common fate. We've been working on that, right? And we will manage this thing together so that the maximum number of us come out the other side. These are not strategies that necessarily require a vaccine, but they require the one thing we must strive to evolve to, a greater sense of empathy and connection in our population. And if we focus thusly, we might find that other problems we still struggle with greatly in our society may start to recede. Very hopeful sounding. We can't know everything about an uncertain future, but we can know that we share a common future as well as a sense of community and love. Well, that's all well and good. And he's not quite finished here, and he has a nice coda to all of it. I'll let you read about his favorite poem, which he believes explains some of this. I'll leave that off for now. And, of course, remind you that we are, in fact, dealing with a bunch of, a small percentage of absolute lunatics who are just simply not going to agree to share a common future with us, and we need to factor that into this equation as well. I'll tell you about what's coming up next after this.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, of course, what's coming up next is the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Justice Putnam will bring you his unique take on all of these stories and much more, including the fact that Neiman Marcus apparently preparing to file for bankruptcy protection as soon as this week. So for all of you who are looking to spend too much on diamond cufflinks, you might be out of luck. We'll see you tomorrow.